sanctions. Middle East correspondent for The Telegraph, Yotam Konfinos, told LBC this is likely to continue.
As much as the public in Israel would like to have a ceasefire with Hamas to get the hostages out, that's not happening right now. There's no indication that ceasefire will happen. And if there's no ceasefire in Gaza, Hezbollah will continue to attack Israel every single day.
It looks like the long-running battle between rail unions and the government is over. Drivers with the ASLEF union have accepted a new pay deal, while the RMT is recommending members at train firms and Network Rail also approve an offer. Ukraine says a drone attack has destroyed a warehouse full of weapons in Russia. One expert says the unverified footage looks like more than 200 tons worth of high explosives detonating. And America's central banks announced an interest rate cut to try to boost a flagging US economy. The Federal Reserve slashed its benchmark rate by 0.5 percentage point, but the Bank of England's unlikely to follow suit tomorrow. In the city, the FTSE 100 has closed down 56 points at 82.53. The pound buys $1.31 and €1.18. LBC weather staying dry tonight with some low cloud moving in from the east for most and a low of 6 degrees. From Global's newsroom for LBC, I'm Daryl Jackson.
This is LBC from Global, leading Britain's conversation. Cross Question with Iain Dale.
Hello, a very good evening. It's 8:02 on LBC. Are you watching on Global Player? If not, why not? Because you can see my 4 beautifully attired guests. I didn't say beautiful guests, I said beautifully attired guests.
Thank you.
With me in the studio, to my far left, Josh Babarinde, Liberal Democrat MP for Eastbourne. He's the party's justice spokesperson. Baroness Nicky Morgan, Conservative peer, former Cabinet Minister. David Buik, businessman, who's markets commentator for Aquis Exchange. And Scarlett MccGwire, political commentator, former communications consultant to the Labour Party. Lots to talk about today, so we'd love you to phone in with your questions. 0345 6060 973. You can WhatsApp on that number. You can text 84850 or say, Alexa, send a comment to LBC.
Call 0345 6060 973. Tweet at LBC. Text 84850. Cross Question with Iain Dale. This is LBC.
Right, let's go to our first caller. It's David in Uxbridge. David, very good evening. What's your question, please?
Good evening, Iain. It's good you're back. I'm glad you're better. So the question for the panel this evening is, if a hostile state planted explosives in thousands of electronic devices in the UK, would they regard that as an act of terrorism, or do they believe this is now a legitimate form of warfare? And it speaks to the, how it gets covered, so it's just, and if the panel just try and speak directly to those points, please. So it's,
okay.
Is this state-sponsored terrorism, or is this now a legitimate form of warfare? Thank you.
Now, just a bit of background to this. 14 people are being killed and at least 450 people injured. I read it's 3,000 injured. Anyway, across Lebanon today by exploding walkie-talkies after 12 people, including 2 children, were killed and almost 3,000 were injured yesterday by exploding pager devices. Now, the Israeli Defense Minister, Yoav Gallant, said this evening that his country is opening a new phase in the war. Well, that's certainly true. So, I'm not sure that Israel has actually accepted responsibility for this, but there's a clear hint in that phrase. Nicky Morgan.
David, it's a good question, but the fact is that however you define it, whether it is an act of terrorism or the opening of a new front of a war, or whether you think it's legitimate or not, the fact is there is now yet another source of massive instability in the Middle East. Another front has opened up. Thousands of people have been injured and killed. And of course, this can be traced back it's a long-standing, but in many ways, particularly to the October the 7th, dreadful, appalling, heinous crime that was committed last year against Israel. I don't know whether you're, in asking the question, whether you're thinking about whether, in fact, this is caught by, some sort of international conventions. But the fact is that renewed efforts to try to either stop this escalating, get parties back talking again, is incredibly important, but also extremely, extremely difficult while feelings are running quite so high. So I don't think I can answer your question direct, David. I'm not an expert on international warfare treaties, but the fact is this cannot be good news for the whole world at all.
But they're attacking Hezbollah terrorists. It's not. I mean, David draws the analogy of an attack on this country. Well, I mean, you can't. The analogy doesn't really work, does it? Because Hezbollah have been sending rockets into Israel, dozens and dozens of them every day. Certainly over the last couple of months. I'm not sure that they were necessarily at the beginning of this. So Israel surely has got a right to say, okay, well, if you as an organisation are sending rockets into our country, we are going to try and disable the people who are doing that. And these are all Hezbollah terrorists, as I understand it, who've got these pagers or walkie-talkies or whatever. So why would that be considered anything wrong?
Well, I'm not saying it's considered wrong. I mean, the question David was asking was how do you treat this? And the fact is, I think for most of us, it doesn't matter which category it falls into. The fact is, it's an escalation of a conflict, exactly as you say, Iain, where rockets have been fired into Israel. This is a long-standing conflict. As I say, the major piece of the escalation was the appalling attacks last October. We're coming up to the anniversary. There are still some hostages. We don't know where, Israeli hostages, we don't know the whereabouts. And Israel absolutely has a right to defend itself. It's the only proper democracy in that part of the world. But the fact is, I think if you talk, I mean, Josh has stood on doorsteps, more recent than me, but I mean, people know that the world is a very uncertain, quite a dark place. There are a number of very serious conflicts. And I go back to what I said, none of this is good. Whatever you define it, it's not good news.
Josh Babarinde for the Liberal Democrats.
Well, to David's question, one can label this in whatever way they like, but at the end of the day, this is an atrocity. So many people have either lost their lives or been injured, and it's just clearly not a sustainable situation. And you used the term earlier, right, about whether a country has a right or not to do something. I think something we can all agree on is that civilians have a right to live in peace.
These are terrorists. These are not civilians.
No, but what I'm saying is that civilians have a right to live in peace across the region, and that is being compromised by the escalation in activity that we're seeing here. And when I was last on, which was in February time, I'm really sad to say we were having the same kind of discussion. But I will repeat what I said back then, because my belief in this is reaffirmed. We will only reach a solution. We will only reach peace when we kick off with what Liberal Democrats have been calling for, an immediate bilateral ceasefire between Israel and in the region in Gaza, because that's the only way to take the heat out of this. That's the only way to create the political space for what is fundamentally a political solution that will lead to peace. And we need hostages out. That's a reputable position to hold, apart from the fact that you know as well as I do that neither side is interested in a ceasefire. Well, I believe that we can get to a place through diplomacy where everyone believes that peace is the fundamental outcome that we want to achieve.
How do you negotiate, or how do you bring that about with terror organisations?
Well,
who've made quite clear that they have no interest in it.
Well, what's really clear is that it's in no one's interest for all of this to continue. It's in no one's interest for civilians to live in fear of their lives and to have their rights compromised. That's why it's essential that we see an immediate bilateral
but that's
ceasefire,
easy to say.
that we see the hostages released, that we see aid in to Gaza to help take the heat out of this. And what we've got to remember is that stripping the politics away just for a moment, which I know is really difficult because it's all intermingled together, but there are human beings at the heart of this. Over the weekend, I met with families of Israeli hostages, and I also met with representatives of families who are affected by what's gone on in Gaza as well. And the key appeal that they are making is that the politics needs to be stripped out and we need to restore humanity to this debate. And that's the key
and sitting in a nice warm studio in London, it's easy to say that, but I think it's very different when you're on the ground, where you have two sides who are so opposed to each other for entirely understandable reasons, who have no interest in the kind of language that you're using there.
Well, I would disagree with that, because I've literally sat down with folks who may have been sitting in a hotel when they were meeting me, but they are absolutely not comfortable, those families of those who are affected in this situation. And they are talking about the need for de-escalation.
I do agree with you, but I'm going to go back to actually what happened. And I think what it's absolutely clear, and one's seen it in the Lebanese media, that Hezbollah has been humiliated, actually, that the fact that it happened, that they've been, in Lebanon, they've been cock of the walk and saying, oh yeah, we do everything, and we have special rules, we can bring in weapons, we can do all that, and our security is blah. And so that is but they have not in any way been hurt as far as sort of raging war. And in Israel, the analysts, I don't mean the sort of Israel is always right, but the serious military analysts cannot understand what's going on, because they can't understand what the next step is. Because Netanyahu has suddenly said, right, on top of war aims, we've got to get everybody back into northern Israel because they've had to evacuate a lot of people because of the bombing. But to get people back into northern Israel is taking on Hezbollah as a war, which, they're fighting in Gaza. So at the moment, I'm not talking about morality.
You say Israel is taking on Hezbollah. I mean, Hamas started it on October the 7th. Hezbollah started this round of actions. But I'm talking about
what people in Israel are trying to understand is why it happened, right? Is what was this the first step? And it is actually for Israel to take everybody back, to take the evacuees back into northern Israel means it means having a serious war with Hezbollah, not just rockets coming, now and again. And I think that in Israel, they are literally, I was talking to an analyst before I came on, because I knew this would happen, who said they are scratching their heads over what happens next. And I put some forward, and he said, stop being rational. This is not a rational act.
David Buik.
I think with Josh and Scarlett, they're laudable, their thoughts, but they're totally impractical. The way I see it is after October, Gaza was the focus. Job not done, but nearly done with Hamas. They are more in control than they were. And now it's focusing on Beirut and the Lebanon and Hezbollah. And frankly, we're dealing with Iran. We're not really dealing with anything else. My thoughts are is that until Benjamin Netanyahu is shown the door, you're not going to get anywhere, because he is omnipotent. He will not be moved. And to be honest with you, until somebody like Hamas gives back some of the people that were taken from them to Israel, we're not going to get anywhere. But I really think this is really focusing on, as far as I'm personally concerned, Netanyahu and no one else.
I was reading a piece the other day that reckoned that Hamas has more or less been destroyed as a military organisation. So from that point of view, Israel has achieved its aim. You say, Scarlett, that it's impossible to predict that what will happen next. But do you all collectively think that this is the start of a major escalation? Or is there now, if it is right that Hamas has been effectively destroyed as an effective organisation, is there an opportunity now? Over to you.
Well, let me come in, because I'm the least competent person, and I speak from the heart.
I'm not sure that's a qualification.
It's going to at least I'm the least professional in this area. As far as I'm concerned, is if you want to crystallise something, you have to get to the kernel of the problem. And the kernel of the problem, in my opinion, is Benjamin Netanyahu. And I honestly think that until he's removed from office, the chances of anybody getting round the table to Joss and to Scarlett's suggestion, and I'm sure it will be backed by Nicky and you and me, it's not going to happen. And therefore, I think the escalation is a serious problem.
I think the reason we're all hesitating is because we'd all like to be able to say yes. There's always a chance for de-escalation. There's always a chance that actually something else happens. Exactly, a prime minister is removed. There's something happens in the UN or with the US or whatever it might be. But I think it is very difficult in the current climate. I think it's the point made to Scarlett about the irrationality, if you like, for understandable reasons. I keep going on about it, but October the 7th was horrific, and so I think it is very difficult to be rational when you are dealing with those sorts of. But
I think Netanyahu is irrational. I think it's more than October the 7th. We have to remember, that Netanyahu encouraged Hamas because he wanted the Palestinians divided. He is irrational. All Netanyahu cares about is Netanyahu. And the other thing to remember is the only time that we got a reasonable number of hostages out was during a ceasefire, right? Is that the IDF going in tends to find bodies. They don't, apart from a few, they're not releasing the hostages, which is why, many people in Israel are very, very unhappy.
Well, you can see that.
You
see that in the sort of protests and the meetings that the Prime Minister has with families and everything else. But the fact is, it is difficult unless you end up, in most of these situations, unless you end up with, as I say, either external factors or individuals on each side who say, enough, we're going to make this happen. And that probably does mean a change of leadership. It is difficult at the moment to see what's going to happen. And I think, I don't know who mentioned Iran, I think it was you, David, but I think that the position of Iran in this. But also don't forget there's another major conflict going on in the world between Russia and Ukraine, where Iran is also involved in having supplied missiles to Russia in order to try to escalate the situation. So they are a huge player, and we haven't talked about them, and I can't see them come to any kind of table anytime soon.
Josh, do you think that David's right, that Netanyahu effectively is the roadblock to peace? Because I'm not sure that you're right, Charlotte, about him being irrational. I think he's entirely rational because he knows as soon as this war is over, he's out.
He's out.
Which is why. So he's added another thing to
dimension.
The war is not going to finish until
that's a rational act. That's not an irrational act.
Yeah, but what I was wondering was whether he was deliberately provoking. He does seem to have done a few provocative things, provoking Hezbollah, Iran, to come in to get the Americans, and I was told that was far too rational.
My take is that the key obstacle to peace is the lack of a ceasefire, and it takes two to tango in a bilateral ceasefire. Netanyahu is one protagonist in that endeavour. But I wanted to pick up on something that was said earlier in terms of Gaza and the kind of the focus on Gaza. And David spoke about being concerned that we forget about the rest of the region.
Don't say forget. That was the focus at the time.
Fine.
And now it's gone north. Anyway, interrupt you.
What concerns me, though, is that the situation that's been left in Gaza. Iain, you said that Hamas's military capability pretty much wiped out. So has a lot of Gaza, and many Gazan people. And there are so many people in Gaza who are experiencing extreme humanitarian hardship, and they're still not getting the aid that they need. And so I think the blockading of aid is another one of those.
I think that has stopped now. I think.
Am
I wrong on that?
Some is getting in. There is certainly
not enough.
But there is nothing like.
It's certainly gone off the news headlines, hasn't it?
Yes, because journalists get bored, right?
Which is why we need to talk about it to ensure that it stays on the agenda. Not enough aid is getting to the people of Gaza.
Not as much aid as there was before October the 7th.
Lots of other subjects that people want to talk about, so we're going to move on in just a couple of minutes' time. But do keep your calls coming. It's 19 minutes past 8.
This is LBC. Cross Question with Iain Dale. Watch live on Global Player. This is LBC.
8:20. Josh Babarinde from the Liberal Democrats is with us, Baroness Nicky Morgan for the Conservatives, David Buik for himself, and Scarlett MccGwire. Well, I'm not going to say full Labour because you're rather detached. Oh, you are a Labour supporter.
I'm a Labour supporter, but
not sort of elected to anything.
I'm certainly not elected, and I don't have to stick to a line.
No, and that's why we
I have not read any briefing pack before I came here.
Right, now we don't normally do this, but here's a brief text question just for David Buik. Marcus in Kent describes himself as a keen amateur investor. He says, can you ask Lord David Buik, in time, David, it's inevitable, what he thinks the Bank of England will do tomorrow when it comes to our interest rates, and why, after the US Federal Reserve slashed rates by 0.5% today. Now, the Bank of England reduced our rate from 5.25 to 5% last month, the first cut for 4 years. Today's cut in the US is also their first reduction for 4 years.
The 0.5% cut, I must confess, I think was a little bit of a surprise. I mean, the labour market, which is what the Federal Reserve has been watching now for the last 2 or 3 months, has looked weaker. By that, to just explain, there's a thing every Friday, the first Friday in the month, called the non-farm payrolls. And that gives you the number of jobs that have been created or in thing. And the amount has come down from about 300,000 a month down to about 140,000. And this is a concern that perhaps the US economy is coming off the boil. And also the last quarter of earnings from the big companies was very disappointing. Now, I know they don't want to hear what I think about the United States, but I'm afraid it's absolutely key. If you'd asked me at 7 o'clock this morning what the MPC and Andrew Bailey would do tomorrow, it would be no change. And they would wait till next month. This is something completely new, because what I find astonishing, and you're all people of the world, is the comments that the Federal Reserve Chairman Jay Powell made, saying almost certainly another 0.5% to 1% this year, and we're going down to 2.9% in 2026. How the hell does he know what's going to happen between now and then? I mean, we've been spending the last 20 minutes talking about this horrific situation in the Middle East. Russia's not over. There could be any number of crises. So I think this forward guidance is absolute nonsense, but we have to listen to it. And if tomorrow the MPC don't cut by 0.25%, then the pound will become too strong, because everybody goes where the highest yield is. And that's where I think that Andrew Bailey and his MPC committee will be wrong-footed by this, because nobody really expected 0.5%. And if he doesn't cut by 0.25%, and he must do it tomorrow, not for the fact that inflation has come down, from 11.1% to 2.2%, is that people are hurting. Cost of living, mortgages and things like that, and they can afford to do it. The bank's actually been ahead of the curve and have been cutting mortgage rates. They need to do it some more. Any brief comments?
No, good. Let's move on.
Bank of England is independent, and rightly so I won't intervene.
Okay. Ben's in Clacton. Hello, Ben.
Hello, Iain. Lovely to have you back.
Thank you.
My question for the panel is, can the National Health Service be mended without mending home care?
That's a really interesting question. Someone said to me the other day that they thought that was the key to reforming the NHS. If you can solve social care, a lot of other things fall into place. Scarlett MccGwire.
I completely agree. I mean, the problem is that our hospitals are full of old people towards the end of life, and many of whom do not need to be there, and they're there because there's not proper social care. And social care is either being able to get into an old people's home that were bought up by investment banks and things, and so are failing, and more importantly, being visited by health workers, and the two are absolutely linked. And until we get that, we can't. I mean, we shouldn't have. A GP said to me that if you didn't have obesity in old people, the hospitals would be mostly empty. Right? That's what.
Why are you looking at me when you say that?
You should be focusing on me.
Well, you're losing a lot of weight, so you won't go into hospital as an overweight old person, Iain. But it's true. So you came out. I mean, you were given keyhole surgery because you could go back and be looked after. And I think it's absolutely essential that we sort it out. And I think that the two are linked. And we need to have fewer people in hospital and more people being treated in the community.
I'm not going to argue, because there is a point to be made about the decline in hospital beds, which personally I think should be reversed now. So I think that it would be a good idea if there could be more hospital beds, which rather goes against what you said. But anyway, let's...
Well, it's a very expensive way of treating people. I also believe in preventative. I mean, I believe in public health, right?
Well, that's what West Streeting was said when he was in the studio an hour ago. Nicky?
So I think the straight answer to Ben's question is no. The NHS can't be mended without, as he said, mending home care. And I think his use of home care is a really interesting one, because when we talk about social care, we are often thinking about older people, and we're thinking about people who are perhaps can't live independent anymore, so they're going to go into a care home, or whether they're going to live with somebody else. But you're right, Scarlett. There's a whole load of other people who are in hospital who perhaps are recovering from operations, who actually much better served by going home or going to another place. You used to have
convalescent, please.
Convalescent, thank you. That's the word.
And cottage hospitals.
Respite. Well, we have one in Loughborough still, actually. It's great, and people come out of the main big hospital in Leicester, and then they go to Loughborough. It doesn't always work. But that is not the only solution to the NHS. We've talked about, haven't talked enough, but we will talk about preventative care, and that's obviously got to be a huge part of the remedy as well. But look, I would say it has been disappointing. I mean, I think Wes Streeting, I know Wes, I think he's going to be a very good health secretary, and it's been good to hear him talking about it. But I am surprised there's been no mention of social care so far, because everybody knows it has to be a component part of talking about the NHS.
David?
Can I ask a favour? I'd like to hear from Josh, because he's been banging on his party.
If you want to chair the debate as well, feel free.
I tell you what, he's been banging on about it for ages, and very well.
What's peerage for?
We'll sort you out. I mean, my take is, I agree with what Ben is saying. We've got lots of patients in our hospitals who are ready to go home, but home or whatever setting is not ready for them.
Yeah.
We need to
especially
resolve
in Eastbourne, I imagine, with the age profile of your
absolutely. I was in hospital for 2 weeks earlier this year. I was really, really ill, and you could see it there as well. Notwithstanding, you have our amazing clinicians that get people, back to decent health or dischargeable enough health, as quickly as possible, and then you've got this backlog. So what needs to happen? Well, Liberal Democrats at our conference this week, we've been talking about some of the big stuff we're saying on health and on social care. We need a serious investment in our NHS first and foremost. So we've spoken about £1.1 billion capital investment in our hospitals that we raised,
which wouldn't touch the sides.
Well, that's just the capital investment. In terms of running costs for the NHS, we've spoken about an extra £3.7 billion. You can look in our manifesto where we're going to get that cash from, but closing various tax loopholes and taxing or reversing the tax cut on big banks. But what we've also spoken about is that this issue is way bigger than party politics, and we need a long-term solution to the care issue. And so we've long advocated, and I remember when I first kind of took an interest in politics, listening to people like Norman Lamb, the former Lib Dem health minister, talk about the need for a cross-party commission or cross-party working when it comes to care. But I think we need to see something like that to come up with a settlement for the next generation of care.
David?
I'm going to be very provocative. We've complained that nobody has been to date. The whole situation with the National Health, I can't argue with much of what you said, but what I'm going to say is the National Health is the third largest employer in the world, 1.5 million people, next to, I think, the Indian Railway Company and the Chinese Army. If anybody thinks that the National Health can be run by any political party on its own, they're on drugs, because it just simply cannot happen. What the whole of the National Health system needs above everything else is motivation. And if you get a proper board of directors and you get a proper management structure with proper incentives for people, I think a lot of this stuff will be sorted out very quickly. I've half thought that Wes Streeting is half thinking along those lines, and I hope so, because, when you consider that people like Lord Stuart Rose and General Messenger were asked by the previous government to write a paper on the National Health, we've never even heard about it. because it's a vote loser. And that's where it's absolutely ridiculous. I can't argue with any of your points, but what I'm saying is the whole thing needs a total overhaul. Otherwise, we'd have the same conversation next year and the year after with very little progress.
I think this also goes beyond the NHS, though, right? So a really important source of care in our country are our carers. And, you know, without them, well, we'd be screwed as a country. And we do not honour their efforts enough. What Liberal Democrats have called for is an increase in carers' allowance, for example, to be able to support them to do the great work that they do. So unless we tackle that and honour our carers there, we're just going to see more and more strain on our NHS, which could exacerbate some of the issues that you're referring to, David.
But actually, David, I mean, what you're saying is that people from the private sector will run it better. And I remember...
I didn't say that. What I meant
was...
you
talked about
I did say it needs a combination of both. The professionals who are in the healthcare and those people who understand business.
Yeah, but the problem with the private sector is, I mean, I remember when they, took over the railways and I knew the guy who was in charge, and he just didn't understand about running a public, running a public sector organisation. That it's not just about the bottom line. I think it's really quite difficult.
But I'm sorry to interrupt, but I mean, one of the points I was going to pick up on yours. I've got an issue with Josh's about just put more money in. I wouldn't say money's needed, but we have tried that, and the OBR. No, you didn't. But money. The OBR has said. I mean, the NHS is going to become unaffordable to us as a country if we don't do something else. The issue with the board of directors, I mean, firstly, I think what actually is needed amongst all these other things is cultural change and accountability. What I'm not saying it's a board of directors, because frankly I don't think one board could run the whole NHS.
No, you're right.
And I think there are far too many self-interested parties who've got things the way they want them. But there's no doubt the accountability, people are working very hard on the front line. The people Josh would have seen on the wards, absolutely working flat out. But there is something about accountability. Donna Ockenden, who did that report on the maternity care, was back on TV again today. I mean, some of these reports where there has been truly awful care, and there seems to be sometimes almost doctors are now having to be taught empathy, because actually in order to really appreciate patients, what they're going through and everything else, and if you don't get the care right in the first place, people just keep coming round again and again.
Can I just say one more thing? Nikki, empathy has been lacking from doctors for years, right? Well, it's nothing new. Thank goodness they're finally having to get it.
Well, exactly.
Right. We must move on.
I would. No,
we really must move on.
I don't think that's fair on doctors. No, I think that doctors are stretched.
We really do have to move on. I mean, doctors may be stretched, but they still. I mean, there are some who, shall we say, don't have the greatest bedside manner. Can we all agree on that?
I don't think it's fair to say that doctors don't have empathy.
Some. Anyway, right, it's 8:33, news time with Daryl Jackson.
At least 14 people have died in a second wave of exploding communication devices across Lebanon. Israel hasn't admitted responsibility, but its defence minister has declared a new phase to the war with a focus on Hezbollah. Train drivers have voted overwhelmingly to accept a multi-year pay offer, and it looks like other union members could do the same. The RMT is recommending workers at operating companies and Network Rail accept their offer too. And the US central bank's announced a bumper interest rate cut in attempting to boost the economy. But most experts expect the Bank of England to keep them on hold here tomorrow. LBC weather staying dry tonight with some low cloud moving in from the east for most and a low of 6 degrees.
This is LBC.
I never liked her.
Question with Iain Dale on LBC.
8:36 on LBC. We have with us Josh Babarinde, Liberal Democrat MP for Eastbourne. He's just today been appointed the party's new Justice spokesperson. How do you feel? I mean, obviously you're thrilled about that, I imagine. You're not going to say that you're not. But for a new MP, and you've several of your contemporaries, I mean, Lisa Smart, who was in this studio a few weeks ago, she's been made effectively Shadow Home Secretary. And I remember after that programme texting Wendy Chamberlain, your chief whip, saying, she's brilliant, you've got to put her on the front bench. So I'm taking full credit. But for new MPs to be appointed to these shadow positions, it must be quite daunting.
It's a big responsibility, but it's an awesome one. I mean, I spent my career pre-politics getting kids out of crime and gangs. And so it's great from being able to do that, which I started about 10 years ago, to now take those insights from the front line. And I often found myself, banging on doors of then ministers to try to get them to change various things to make life better for them, but principally for victims and would-be victims. And now it's great to be able to be the one on whose door is being banged on, maybe.
Nicky Morgan is here, David Buik and Scarlett MccGwire. Right, a text question from Janie. Between Starmer getting showered with free stuff and his advisor getting more money than he gets, can this government escape the description of sleazy? Now, it's been reported that the Prime Minister's Chief of Staff, Sue Gray, requested and has been given an annual salary of £170,000, which is £3,000 more than Sir Keir Starmer himself is paid. I have to say, I think the Cabinet Office have denied that Sue Gray requested this salary increase. David Buik.
Wow, that's a hornet's nest to start with. I actually don't care whether Sue Gray gets 170,000 or 370,000 if she's the right person for the job. We're going back to what I think in regard to Parliament, and to say people like Nicky and Josh have been in there, in my humble opinion, hopelessly underpaid. And I actually think that I would get the House of Commons if it was down to me, and it's a good job for you lot that it's not down to me, down to 400 MPs. And the opening shot across the bows would be £200,000, and you would attract the right kind of people in all walks of life. And you would have people who are far more devoted, not focused on how much they can make in the media or other areas and the rest of it. I wouldn't preclude them, but I just think that Sue Gray, if she's top-notch, which I'm told she is, you charge what the traffic will bear. And if the Prime Minister's salary is too low, that's not my problem. That is what is decided that he gets his salary from. But the fact is that...
Well, he can't afford his own clothes.
Yes, he can, but why not if somebody wants to give them to him? I think this is a big, big red herring. I don't care about it, to be honest.
OK, Josh?
Sorry.
I think the public are sick and tired of hearing about these kind of things. And what people really want to hear is... Well, in fact, I'll tell you what I saw this morning. I was at my local food bank this morning, Eastbourne Food Bank, run by a guy called Howard Wardle, who retires next week. So I want to give him a shout out right here. He's an amazing guy. And the people who are accessing that food bank, they're the ones who need the attention here. The people who have been struggling with the cost of living for quite some time now, people who are going to be disadvantaged by, say, the retention of the two-child benefit cap, people who are going to be disadvantaged by the loss of their winter fuel allowance, despite the fact they need it to heat their homes. They're the folks who should be getting the attention here when it comes to who has enough money to get by. And I think that this, it's not a good look, what's happening at the top of government, but it's a distraction from the experience that millions of people are having in the real world.
Scarlett, of course, during the election campaign and before, Keir Starmer was sort of saying, well, we're not going to be like the other lot. But a lot of people are saying, well, it's a bit like Animal Farm. Can you tell the difference?
I mean, I think you can. I think Josh is right that it's a distraction, and I think it's really unfortunate. And I don't think he should have had somebody paying for his clothes, because I think we need to get on to more important things. I absolutely agree with David that Sue Gray could earn whatever she wants. I mean, I don't think it's a story, actually. No. I think it's absolutely fine.
But there's a Get Sue Gray movement.
There is a Get Sue Gray movement, which is which is why this is. But what I'm saying is that frankly, how much she earns, how much they decide to pay her, which is far more to the point. I disagree with David about having MPs being paid 200,000. I don't think that money gets you the right people. I actually think we have some really, really top-notch MPs who I also think 90-odd thousand a year is perfectly enough to pay somebody, and I think you get it, and you do not need more money.
Nicky?
Well, straight up, I'm going to avoid getting into how much we should pay parliamentarians and members of the House of Commons, and I've been there and all the rest. I know what an extremely tough job it is. I also know how important it is to have a really good person in Downing Street as Chief of Staff. What completely mystifies me is the fact that we are just over 2 months after the new government was elected. This is a government that has spent, a number of years in opposition, had a very clear view on these sorts of stories when they came up for the Conservative Party. Keir Starmer is not a new Member of Parliament. He knows the rules about disclosing what he's been given and everything else. And I don't understand, and I think most of the Labour MPs don't understand how it is that they're talking about this at this point of their administration rather than something else. And I think whoever is behind the Get Sue Gray movement, and I've worked with Sue Gray a little bit in the past, I've encountered her. The fact is we need good government and good governance in this country. And I think Sue Gray can be very much a part of that. So whoever's behind the Stop Sue Gray or the Get Sue Gray movement just needs to stop and think about what they're doing to their party and to their government.
Well, what
Keir Starmer needs to get a grip on Downing Street, because only if the Prime Minister lays down stop, and actually if he just said, look, this has been absolutely full on, I should have made the declaration, I didn't do it, I'm very sorry, I think most of the public would understand, and it's not going to happen.
Which is
again.
what Tony Blair did after the Bernie Eccleston thing in 1997.
Well, I remember Sherry Blair had the thing about the flats, and she went out and said, I'm sorry, it was a mistake, I should have done better, but I didn't. And actually people understand genuine human error.
But let's not pretend that the agenda here is not to drive a dedicated public servant out of the government.
I agree, and I think it's absolutely outrageous,
ridiculous.
And as I say, we need. Look, I mean, the election result was the election result. It wasn't a surprise to me as a Conservative. I'd much rather see a Conservative government in power. But the fact is, actually, what I really was looking forward to after July the 4th was having a government that was stable. That's what business needs, it's what the country needs, it's what NHS reform needs, it's what prisons need, and actually who are stable, were going to be there for a full 5-year term and had been very clear about how they wanted to run and to do things differently. Go back to my point. I am mystified by how it is the administration are allowing these stories to come up this early on.
OK. Right, we'll move on in just a moment. 0345 6060 973. And don't forget our fun question at around 2 minutes to 9. You won't want to miss out on that. It's 8:45.
LBC. Cross Question with Iain Dale on LBC.
8:47 on LBC. We have Josh Babarinde, Nicky Morgan, David Buik and Scarlett MccGwire with us answering your questions. A text question from Tabitha in Lewis. How can respect for the police be restored? Scarlett.
I think it's...
Actually, let me give you a bit of background to this, because the Metropolitan Police Commissioner, Sir Mark Rowley, has given a speech this evening in which he's condemned what he called shameful abuse of our officers and the silence of many in authority, adding that when people, be they politicians or the public, throw accusations and slurs at the police, they put them in danger by emboldening thugs. Last week, a report by His Majesty's Inspectorate of Constabulary condemned politicians for making claims of two-tier policing, which the Chief Inspector admitted was that it was Suella Braverman and Rishi Sunak who were responsible for these claims.
Yeah, I think there are two different things. I think one is a problem of officers in the Met. I mean, there was somebody, it was in the papers only this morning that somebody accused of rape was back dealing with vulnerable women. I mean, frankly, there's a story like that about every 3 weeks from the Metropolitan Police about either a racist or, more often, frankly, some person abusing women. But if we get onto the two-tier policing, I mean, it was absolutely appalling, and the way that there isn't two-tier policing in the country, and it was somehow felt that while the police were okay with the pro-Palestinian people, the pro-peace people actually, that the way they dealt with the rioters was tougher. The rioters were throwing things at them. You had rioters being done for injuring policemen. The thing about the Gaza protests, very, very important, all of them were in collaboration with the police. Then the police could pick out people who were being anti-Semitic and pull them aside, and did quietly. But you had week after week 100,000 people that did not injure one policeman, and then we call it two-tier policing when they get attacked and actually have to arrest people.
Josh.
Well, there are some bad eggs in police forces. We've heard about those in the cases of, for example, Wayne Couzens, and we saw with the case of Stephen Port, homophobia in the police as well. And so the Metropolitan Police has got some way to go to restore trust.
But do you think we in the media give too much prominence to these cases, given that in a force of 32,000 people, I mean, inevitably there are going to be what you call bad eggs, but maybe the media is partly responsible for this idea that there is two-tier police?
Well, I think it's really important that the media and other stakeholders hold our police to account. I think it's a really important role that media play in our democracy. But I think there are other factors to consider as well. So government, I think, needs to honour the police. We've seen lots of police cuts over the years. I've seen some of the impact of those in my former work supporting kids out of crime, out of gangs, and a lack of community policing where police really had the capacity to build more relationships with their communities and earn trust that way. That was completely broken, and so that funding and that community policing needs to be restored. But thirdly, when it comes to the role of the far right, I mean, I think they're one of the biggest threats to policing. They're one of the biggest threats to the rule of law. They have form in undermining key institutions of the state. You take what happened during Brexit when they were saying of our judges that they were traitors and enemies of the people. You've seen what the far right have been saying in response to the riots a few weeks ago, two-tier policing, etc. This is how fundamental institutions of the state get eroded.
What about two-tier justice? Because we were talking on Monday about the sentencing of Hugh Edwards. And there are a lot of people who think, well, if that had been Joe Bloggs from 32 Acacia Avenue, Eastbourne, he wouldn't have got off with a suspended sentence.
You obviously haven't read The Sun today. They've looked into it, and actually that is the sentence that most people...
I understand that. I do understand that, but I was quite shocked that it wasn't a prison sentence. But you're right, it is in the sentencing guidelines.
Yes.
But, I mean, that still feeds into this narrative, doesn't it, about the two-tier justice system?
I mean, the fundamental problem there, aside from, the crimes that we've heard about and have been reported on being absolutely disgusting and without question condemned, fundamental problem there is Parliament, right? So if we want our courts to be emboldened to deliver sentences different to what we're hearing about now, then it's Parliament's job to legislate to change those. It's not for politicians to decide, and should never be for politicians to decide what sentences people get on a case-by-case basis, but it is for politicians to establish sentences and also to focus on rehabilitation of offenders, which delivers true justice for victims and reduces would-be victims.
The Attorney General is a politician, and Tom Tugendhat yesterday was telling me he had written to the Attorney General to say, well, look, I want you to review this sentence.
But I think what is extraordinary is Tom Tugendhat has been an MP for the governing party for very many years that had an opportunity to change sentencing legislation if he really wanted to. He didn't do that. Instead, he complains while he's running to be Tory leader on this particular case.
I think that's unfair. I think that's unfair because I think that there has been, honestly, having been there was plenty of criminal justice acts every year the Home Office got. I mean, whether they made best use of the legislative time available to them, but there were plenty of acts and plenty of stuff about sentencing, and it's absolutely right. Anybody can say, hang on, I think that's an unduly lenient sentence, or the other way, which is I think that's actually not within the guidelines and should be reviewed. So I think it's right. People ask the question. You will, there's been lots of pressure on anyone who's elected to ask for things to be reconsidered. Whether that's in relation to sentencing or in relation to benefits claims or anything like that.
He had 14 years to do it in government.
Well, also that case has only happened on Monday.
No, but also, Nicky, he just didn't know what he was talking about. I mean, he was just an opportunist who said this is terrible. I mean, he didn't actually look and see. As the journalist from The Sun did, that actually that is the standard, that very, very few people go to jail for indecent images.
Most people had the reaction that Iain's talked about. I mean, I was listening. Most people had the reaction that seems very unduly lenient given the severity of the images of what he was looking at and the engagement he had. I listened to The Sun's editor talking on a rival radio station, I'm afraid to say on Tuesday morning, and I'm sorry about that. And I stand corrected. But she was talking about it, and she was, at that moment, she was very shocked by the sentence. And clearly what she did as a great editor was to say to her colleagues, go and look into this and write it up and see whether, in fact, this is what it should be. Can I just answer the question? Oh, have we got time?
Go on. Well, very, very quickly.
So the answer is I haven't heard the rest of Mark Rowley's speech, but I would much rather. I agree with the comments made about two-tier policing, but they really want respect. I do think the conduct of officers is incredibly important, and I wish perhaps he did, but I wish Mark Rowley said more about that in his speeches before he talks about everything. But it's right. We should all be respectful of the police, most of whom do a very difficult and challenging job that most of us do not want to do.
Agreed. David, briefly, if you can.
Not enough of them, I'm afraid. I blame the Home Secretary for 6 years, or whatever she was, because it was part of no offence, Nicky, a part of austerity. And the one area that shouldn't have happened, in my humble opinion, is the police.
And the Home Secretary waiting to come on too.
Well, he wasn't Home Secretary at the time, though, when the big stuff was happening. I'm afraid it was the former Prime Minister, wasn't it? And I think that's the problem, that we made the cuts far too severe with the police force. I'm a massive supporter of the police. I think they've got a horrible job, but there's nothing like enough of them.
OK, right, we can squeeze in one more question now from Andy in Cheltenham, who says, we heard from the previous government that the UK is the fastest growing economy in the G7. Actually, it's the Office of Budget Responsibility that said that. And as soon as the government changed hands, it's all doom and gloom. Where does the truth lie? Using that word advisedly. And what is productivity forecast to look like, considering what's expected with employment reforms? Josh?
Well, I think it's really clear. Rachel Reeves outlined it in her statement a few weeks ago, that there is this black hole. She describes it as a £22 billion black hole.
Wrong.
That that needs to be closed. There's a mess that the last government created.
Well, she's exacerbated it by agreeing to these above-inflation pay rises.
And we can all see the results of that mess. We can see an NHS, to the tune of our discussion earlier.
You're not answering the question. The question was about economic growth. The last government said, well, we're the best in the G7. This government is all gloom and doom. What's the truth?
Well, part of the question was, is there really this black hole that's being discussed? And
that wasn't the question. I've got the question in front of me. It didn't mention a black hole.
What I'm saying is that there is a problem, right? There is this black hole. It needs to be filled. Growth is not fast enough to be able to bring in the tax revenues in order to pay for the key services that we want to be delivered. Why would the government make something like that up? Why would it cast this unpopularity on itself when we can all see?
But do you think that the Prime Minister particularly is going too far in the doom and gloom stakes when inflation is where it should be, unemployment is on the way down, growth is better than most other countries? I mean, that's not... You're right about borrowing, but the rest of it looks reasonably healthy.
Well, I do think that what people want to see is hope and optimism. I do think that when people voted for a brand new government, that refreshment across our country, that they wanted to see something more hopeful. And I do think Keir Starmer's tone has been pretty Eeyore.
The fiscal situation of the country is poor. Josh is right. It's got nothing to do with growth. Absolutely nothing to do with it at all. It is bad. But if you look at the United States, they borrowed up from $26 trillion to $33 trillion in a period of a year. And we are towards the top of our borrowing situation. But one thing I want to make clear is there was a wonderful gilt auction, and that's where the government raised its money the week before last. It raised £8 billion like that. It was 10 times oversubscribed. And why? Because the world perceives that the United Kingdom is a stable place to invest. What terrifies me at the budget, and Scarlett and I had a little chat before here, is that I do not want to see the Chancellor discouraging inward investment, which we desperately need for all these green economies that we've got, for all our fintechs, and for all these wonderful companies that require money and will get money. But if we start putting up capital gains tax at ludicrous levels, or CGT, or corporation tax, you will see people leaving this country in their droves. Forget the people leaving the country. It's the American, the Far Eastern money won't come here, and we desperately need it. We're actually in good shape.
Brief answers, if I can, from Nicky and Scarlett.
Look, I think the economy actually had turned a corner, and I think that the government would be ill-advised if they were to be so doom and gloom that it put off that international investment. There are undoubtedly going to be challenges ahead, and I saw a headline this evening saying that one of the problems is a shrinking workforce, and actually, so, that's one of the challenges, is how do you make sure we've got enough people, and that's part of the productivity answer.
Scarlett?
I mean, what I'm hoping, I don't know, what I'm hoping is that Rachel Reeves is going to go for growth in her budget. There's going to be some very nasty stuff, but I'm hoping that we're being prepared for the nasty stuff, and then she's going to say, but we've got lots of good ideas.
Right, John in Winchmore Hill has our fun question. What is the most expensive item of clothing your panel members have purchased, and how much did it cost? Well, I imagine your jacket, Josh, for those watching. I mean, that's a pretty spectacular jacket.
Well, the cost of this jacket was a broken heart, let me tell you.
Oh.
And so maybe it is my most expensive item of clothing that I have. I was meant to go on a date. Date didn't show up. I felt pretty rubbish about myself. I saw this suit. I thought, that's pretty cool.
Who's
I tried
the
it
MP
on,
now,
and
though?
the rest is history. Yeah.
Scarlett?
I'm completely pathetic. I was trying to... I think it's a coat that I bought in a Ted Baker sale that is too small for me, so I even regret that. And I don't think it made 300 quid. I do not buy very expensive clothes.
Me neither. Not that you can tell, obviously. Nicky?
I think it was my wedding dress, and I think that was about £1,500.
See, that's ridiculous, isn't it? You're going to wear it once.
It's the big day of it.
I know, but...
I'm now going to tell Mr Morgan that.
Yeah.
And he'll send you a text message.
Well, if he reacts badly, you might be able to wear it again. David?
Most people who know me know that I'm pear-shaped and look like a badly wrapped present. So much as I'd like to go...
No.
Yes! Much as I would like to go to Marks and Spencer's and buy my suits, I can't even get my left foot in them, let alone around my waist. So regrettably, I have a suit made Cost 800 quid, sorry.
800? Oh, my God. I've never
tell you what, they're about 2,500 in Southern.
Right, let me tell you that on Monday's panel, live from the Labour Party conference in Liverpool, we have the General Secretary, if I'm allowed in Liverpool, we have the General Secretary of the Communications Workers Union, Dave Ward, new Labour MP and former soldier, Mike Tapp, plus we'll be joined by a member of Keir Starmer's government. So they tell us, we will see. Thank you all very much indeed for joining us. Coming up in a moment, it's the second of our Conservative Party leadership contender hours. We have James Cleverly joining us for me to put some questions to him, and also for you too as well. Lots of you did last night with Tom Tugendhat. Some really interesting questions, so we'll expect the same from you tonight. The number to call if you'd like to speak to James Cleverly, 0345 6060 973. And if you look at the experience of all four of the contenders, he is without doubt the most experienced, having served as Home Secretary, before that Foreign Secretary. But does experience count in this race? Is it about something more than experience? Well, you put your questions to James Cleverly in just a moment here on LBC.
On your radio, on Global Player, and
Play LBC.
Leading Britain's conversation. This is LBC.
From Global's newsroom, there's been a second wave of exploding